The Girl Who Whispered to the Dead, and What They Told Her. It was late October in 2012, a time when the air in small-town America carried the faint scent of decaying leaves and wood smoke. The town of Ridgewood, nestled deep within the rolling hills of upstate New York, had always been one of those places where nothing much happened. Its population rarely exceeded 3,000 people, and most families could trace their roots back generations. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, yet secrets still managed to slip through the cracks. Ridgewood wasn't exactly known for anything remarkable. There were no famous landmarks, no bustling city streets, just quiet neighborhoods lined with aging maple trees and weathered clapboard houses. But if you asked older residents about the history of the area, they might mention an old cemetery tucked away at the edge of town, a forgotten patch of land surrounded by dense woods. That cemetery, known locally as Willowbrook Cemetery, dated back to the early 1800s. Few people visited it anymore, save for a handful of locals who occasionally placed flowers on graves or teenagers daring each other to spend the night there during Halloween. That year, however, something unusual began to draw attention to Willowbrook Cemetery. People started noticing strange things. Lights flickering among the tombstones after dark, shadows moving between the trees without explanation, and whispers carried on the wind that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. At first, these reports were dismissed as overactive imaginations or pranks played by bored kids. But then word spread about a girl named Emily Dawson, and everything changed. Emily Dawson was 16 years old, tall and lanky, with pale skin and long, straight black hair that she often wore tied back in a loose ponytail. She lived with her grandmother in a modest house on Maple Street, not far from the center of town. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 8, leaving her in the care of her only living relative. Grandma Ruth was a stern woman in her 70s, known for her sharp tongue and even sharper eyes. She ran a small antique shop out of the front room of their home, selling dusty relics and faded photographs to tourists passing through Ridgewood. From the outside, Emily appeared to be like any other teenager. She attended Ridgewood High School, kept mostly to herself, and spent her free time sketching in notebooks or reading books borrowed from the library. But there was something different about her, something that set her apart from the other kids. For as long as anyone could remember, Emily had claimed she could hear voices, whispering voices that no one else seemed to notice. At first, her teachers chalked it up to an overactive imagination, but as she grew older, the whispers became harder to ignore. By the time she turned 14, Emily stopped trying to explain what she heard. Instead, she began spending more and more time alone, retreating into her own world. One day, while exploring the woods behind her house, she stumbled upon Willowbrook Cemetery. Something about the place drew her in, an inexplicable pull that she couldn't resist. She wandered among the crumbling headstones, tracing her fingers over the weathered inscriptions. And then, for the first time, the whispers grew louder. At first, they sounded like murmurs, indistinct and muffled, as though coming from beneath the ground. But as Emily stood motionless in the center of the cemetery, the voices began to take shape. They spoke in hushed tones, some pleading, others angry, all desperate to be heard. Over time, Emily realized that the voices belonged to the dead, or at least, that's what they claimed. They told her stories of their lives, their deaths, and the regrets that haunted them. Some begged her to deliver messages to loved ones. Others simply wanted someone to listen. Word of Emily's gift or curse, depending on how you looked at it, spread slowly at first. A neighbor mentioned seeing her sitting among the graves late at night, muttering under her breath. A classmate swore they saw her talking to thin air near the school playground. Before long, rumors began circulating throughout Ridgewood. Some dismissed them as nonsense, but others weren't so sure. Among those who believed was Mrs. Patterson, a retired schoolteacher who lived 2 doors down from Emily and her grandmother. Mrs. Patterson had lost her son Michael in a hunting accident 5 years earlier, and she approached Emily one evening, tears streaming down her face. "Can you help me?" Mrs. Patterson asked, her voice trembling. "I need to know, is he okay? Does he miss me?" Emily hesitated. She didn't fully understand what she was capable of, let alone whether she should use her ability to comfort grieving strangers. But something in Mrs. Patterson's eyes compelled her to say yes. That night, she returned to Willowbrook Cemetery and called out to the darkness. Within moments, the whispers returned, louder and clearer than ever before. One voice rose above the rest, a young man's voice, soft and hesitant. "Mom," it said, "tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I love her." When Emily relayed the message to Mrs. Patterson the next morning, the older woman broke down sobbing. After that, more people came forward, seeking answers from beyond the grave. Emily tried to keep her visits to the cemetery discreet, but it wasn't long before the entire town knew what she was doing. Most treated her with a mixture of awe and suspicion, whispering behind her back whenever she passed by. Some even accused her of being involved in witchcraft or consorting with evil spirits. Despite the growing unease surrounding her, Emily continued to visit Willowbrook Cemetery every few nights. She couldn't explain why, but she felt drawn to the place, almost as if it were calling to her. The voices grew stronger with each visit, their desperation palpable. Sometimes they overwhelmed her, filling her mind with images and emotions that weren't hers. Other times, they offered glimpses of events that hadn't yet occurred, warnings of accidents, illnesses, and tragedies waiting to unfold. One evening in mid-November, Emily arrived at the cemetery later than usual. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the uneven ground. A cold wind swept through the trees, rustling the dry leaves and sending chills down her spine. As she made her way toward the oldest section of the graveyard, she noticed something unusual. A figure standing near the edge of the woods, partially obscured by the gloom. At first, she thought it might be one of the local teenagers playing another prank. But as she drew closer, she realized the figure wasn't moving. It stood perfectly still, its features blurred by the dim light. The whispers around her grew frantic, urging her to leave, to run, to get away as fast as she could. Ignoring their warnings, Emily called out. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the knot forming in her stomach. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised an arm and pointed toward a cluster of headstones nearby. Emily followed the gesture, her heart pounding in her chest. Etched into the largest stone was a name she recognized, Abigail Hargrove. According to local legend, Abigail had been a young woman who vanished under mysterious circumstances in the early 1900s. Her body was never found, and her disappearance remained unsolved to this day. As Emily stared at the gravestone, the whispers erupted into a deafening cacophony. She clutched her head, trying to block out the noise, but it was no use. Suddenly, a single voice cut through the chaos. A woman's voice, filled with sorrow and rage. "You shouldn't have come here," it hissed. "This isn't your place." Before Emily could react, the figure stepped forward, emerging from the shadows. Its face was gaunt and hollow, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. For a moment, Emily froze, unable to move or speak. Then, with a surge of adrenaline, she turned and ran, her feet slipping on the damp grass as she fled toward the safety of the trees. She didn't stop until she reached her grandmother's house, slamming the door shut behind her and locking it tight. Grandma Ruth found her huddled on the floor of the living room, trembling uncontrollably. When Emily finally managed to tell her what had happened, Ruth's expression hardened. "That cemetery has always been trouble," she said, her voice low and grave. "Your mother used to go there too, you know. Said she could hear things. I warned her to stay away, but she wouldn't listen. And now look where it got her." Emily's blood ran cold. She had never heard her grandmother speak of her mother's connection to the cemetery before. Questions swirled in her mind, but before she could ask any of them, Ruth grabbed her coat and headed for the door. "We're going to see Pastor Lewis," she declared. "If anyone knows how to deal with this, it's him." Pastor Lewis was an elderly man who had served as the town's minister for nearly 40 years. His church, St. Mary's Episcopal, sat atop a hill overlooking Ridgewood, its steeple visible from almost anywhere in town. When Emily and her grandmother arrived, he greeted them warmly, inviting them into his study. After hearing their story, he nodded solemnly. "There are forces in this world we don't fully understand," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Forces that can tempt us, deceive us, and sometimes harm us. If what you say is true, Emily, then you must be careful. These spirits may not have your best interests at heart." He handed her a small leather-bound Bible and instructed her to carry it with her at all times. "Faith is a powerful shield," he added, "but even faith has its limits." Over the next few weeks, Emily avoided the cemetery, heeding Pastor Lewis's advice. The whispers persisted, though, growing quieter and more distant as time went on. She hoped they would eventually fade altogether, allowing her to return to a normal life. But deep down, she knew it wasn't over, not completely. On December 14th, just days before Christmas, Emily woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of scratching at her bedroom window. She pulled back the curtains to find the same gaunt figure from the cemetery staring back at her, its lips curled into a sinister smile. The whispers flooded her mind once again, louder and more insistent than ever before. And this time, they brought a message, one that would change everything. Emily's heart raced as she stared at the figure outside her window. Its hollow eyes seemed to pierce through her, freezing her in place. The whispers swirled chaotically in her mind, overlapping and growing louder with each passing second. She could feel the weight of their desperation pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Among the cacophony, one voice stood out, a woman's voice, cold and commanding. "Abigail," Emily whispered, recognizing the tone from her encounter at Willowbrook Cemetery. "What do you want?" The figure tilted its head slightly, as if amused by her question. Then, without warning, it vanished into thin air, leaving behind only silence. Emily's knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the floor, clutching the Bible Pastor Lewis had given her. The room felt unnaturally cold, despite the warmth of the winter night seeping through the walls. For hours, she sat there, too frightened to move. When dawn finally broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, she mustered the courage to crawl back into bed. Sleep eluded her, but exhaustion eventually took over, pulling her into a restless slumber. The next morning, Emily confided in her grandmother about what had happened. Ruth listened intently, her face pale and drawn. Without saying a word, she retrieved an old wooden box from the attic, a box Emily had never seen before. Inside was a collection of yellowed letters, photographs, and newspaper clippings. One article caught Emily's attention. It was dated 1903 and detailed the disappearance of Abigail Hargrove, whose body had never been found. As Emily sifted through the contents of the box, she discovered something even more unsettling, a letter written in her mother's handwriting. It described her mother's own experiences with the cemetery, including encounters with Abigail's spirit. According to the letter, Abigail had accused her mother of taking something that belonged to her, a locket containing a lock of her hair. The final lines of the letter sent chills down Emily's spine. "She won't stop until she gets it back," I've tried to hide it, but she knows where it is. If anything happens to me, tell Emily not to trust her." Emily looked up at her grandmother, tears streaming down her face. "Did Mom have this locket? Is that why?" Ruth nodded solemnly. "Your mother kept it hidden for years, but Abigail found her anyway. She drowned in Willow Creek shortly after writing that letter. We never told anyone about the locket because we didn't want to believe it was real. But now," her voice trailed off, leaving the implication hanging heavily in the air. Emily realized then that her connection to the cemetery wasn't random. It was tied directly to her family's past. Whatever debt her mother owed to Abigail, it now fell to Emily to repay. That evening, armed with the Bible, a flashlight, and the locket her grandmother reluctantly handed over, Emily returned to Willowbrook Cemetery. The wind howled through the trees as she made her way to Abigail's grave. Placing the locket on the headstone, she stepped back and waited. At first, nothing happened. The night was eerily quiet, save for the rustling leaves and distant hoot of an owl. Then, slowly, the temperature dropped, and the air grew thick with an oppressive energy. Shadows began to coalesce around the grave, forming the familiar outline of the gaunt figure. This time, however, it wasn't alone. Dozens of other figures emerged from the darkness, their faces obscured, but their presence undeniable. Abigail stepped forward, her glowing eyes fixed on Emily. She reached out a skeletal hand and picked up the locket, examining it closely. For a moment, the tension in the air seemed to ease. Then, without warning, Abigail turned to face Emily, her expression twisting into a mask of fury. "You think this is enough?" she hissed, her voice echoing like thunder. "Do you know what I gave up? What I endured? This trinket means nothing compared to what I lost." Before Emily could react, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The other spirits closed in, their whispers rising to a deafening roar. Panicking, she clutched the Bible tighter and recited the Lord's Prayer under her breath. To her surprise, the spirits hesitated, their movements slowing as if repelled by her words. Seizing the opportunity, Emily backed away, keeping her gaze locked on Abigail. "I'm sorry for what happened to you," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "But my family didn't take your life. You need to let us go." For a moment, it seemed like Abigail might relent. Her form flickered, becoming less solid, less menacing. Then, with a guttural scream, she lunged toward Emily, her claw-like hands reaching for her throat. Time seemed to slow as Emily stumbled backward, tripping over a root and falling onto the damp grass. Just as Abigail's fingers brushed against her skin, a bright light erupted from the Bible in her hands. It engulfed the entire cemetery, driving the shadows away and silencing the whispers once and for all. When the light faded, Emily found herself lying alone in the clearing. The locket was gone, and the oppressive atmosphere had lifted. Trembling but alive, she staggered to her feet and ran home, not daring to look back. In the weeks that followed, life in Ridgewood returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could be. The strange occurrences at Willowbrook Cemetery ceased entirely, and the townsfolk gradually stopped talking about Emily's gift. Even Mrs. Patterson stopped visiting, though she occasionally sent notes of gratitude. Emily, however, couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't truly resolved anything. While the immediate threat was gone, she knew that Abigail's anger stemmed from something deeper, something unresolved. Determined to uncover the truth, she began researching Ridgewood's history, piecing together fragments of information about Abigail's life and death. Her investigation led her to an abandoned cabin deep in the woods, miles from town. Inside, she found evidence suggesting that Abigail may have been murdered, not by her family, but by someone else entirely, someone who still lived in Ridgewood. As Emily stood in the dusty ruins of the cabin, holding a faded photograph of a man whose face looked eerily familiar, she realized that her ordeal was far from over. The whispers were silent for now, but they would return, and when they did, they would demand justice. And Emily knew she wouldn't be able to ignore them again.